London in 1816 was a grim place. The year had gone down in history as the year without a summer. A massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia had cast ash into the stratosphere, lowering temperatures around the globe and bringing food shortages to Europe. In Britain, harvests failed, bread prices spiked, and hungry crowds rioted. Added to this hardship was the sudden return of thousands of soldiers and sailors after the defeat of Napoleon. Jobless veterans flooded London's streets and crime surged as the city struggled to absorb them. Against this backdrop loomed Newgate Prison, a soot-blackened fortress on Newgate Street next to the Old Bailey. Here, men and women accused of everything from forgery to murder waited to learn their fate. The building dated back to the 12th century, but by 1816 it was overcrowded and disease-ridden. Some inmates slept on straw with only bread and water to sustain them. One carpenter named Valentine Fryer even begged to be transferred to a prison hulk because the rations at Newgate were so meagre. Inside Newgate that autumn were 6 condemned men whose sentences had recently been commuted from hanging to transportation for life. Transportation meant exile to Australia. They would be marched in irons to the docks, put aboard a rotting hulk on the River Thames, and eventually shipped halfway across the world. For most convicts, this was a slow death. Few ever returned. But these 6 men, James Hickey, Thomas Culliver, Maurice Healey, Solomon Bowerman, John Hardy, and John Harrison, decided they would never step onto that ship. They hatched a plan to do the unthinkable: escape Newgate. If you enjoy uncovering forgotten jailbreaks and dark corners of history, hit subscribe now, because stories like this one get more incredible as they unfold. To grasp the risk these men took, imagine daily life in Newgate. The prison's dark stone walls oozed damp, the smell of rot and sewage lingered in every corridor. Rats nested in straw mattresses, lice crawled through blankets, and the sick lay alongside the healthy. The warders were underpaid and corrupt. Those with money could buy better food or even private rooms, while the poorest inmates survived on coarse bread and watery broth. Transportation sentences were common because Britain had abolished the American colonies as a destination in 1776 and instead shipped its convicts to New South Wales. Before boarding transport vessels, convicts were held on floating prison hulks, decommissioned warships stripped of their masts and moored along the Thames. Conditions on these hulks were harsh. Men were locked below deck at night, and by day they were rowed to shore to work in chain gangs. Fights and theft were common. There were only 4 ways off a hulk: transportation, pardon, escape, or death. Even so, some prisoners considered the hulks preferable to Newgate because they could get more food. It was into this world that the 6 conspirators were thrust. All had been convicted in the summer of 1816 at the Old Bailey. Hickey, Culliver, and Healey were found guilty of burglary, Bowerman, Hardy, and Harrison of horse stealing. Although all were condemned to die, their sentences were commuted to transportation. Each wore heavy irons around his ankles, a constant reminder of the chains awaiting them. We're just setting the stage. To follow this tale all the way to its unbelievable end, remember to subscribe. It helps the channel keep unearthing stories like this. Who were the Newgate Six? James Hickey was a nimble-fingered thief from London's East End. Though he rarely used violence, repeated convictions had made him a transport man, considered too dangerous to leave in England. Thomas Culliver was a wiry burglar who had once escaped from custody, only to be recaptured. Maurice Healey, Irish by birth, was described in papers as bold but naive. He would prove the most talkative after the escape. Solomon Bowerman was the eldest, 30 years old, a horse thief who grew up poor in Charlbury, Oxfordshire. He and his brothers James and George had a history of poaching and theft. Bowerman's death sentence was commuted to transportation after his conviction. John Hardy and John Harrison were labourers turned horse thieves, hardened by poverty and war. These men were not saints, but neither were they hardened killers. Their crimes were motivated by hunger and desperation. In 1816, stealing livestock or breaking into a house could mean death by hanging. Transportation, though brutal, was seen as a merciful alternative, yet to them it felt like being buried alive. If you want more profiles on forgotten criminals and their daring plots, be sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss our deep dives. The idea germinated in their ward, where they noticed a large wooden cupboard against one wall. To the guards it was a piece of furniture, to the prisoners it was cover. It was deep enough for a man to hide inside and provided a blind spot from the warder's view. Healey later testified that 5 of the men had been working at the wall for 5 days. They squeezed into the cupboard after lights out, using scraps of metal and iron, perhaps a contraband file or pieces of a spoon, to chip away at the bricks and timber. Newgate's walls were of prodigious thickness, so every chip had to be concealed. They hid rubble under straw and dust in their clothes, working in complete darkness and silence. Bowerman possessed a small file and used it to cut off his irons. This gave him greater freedom of movement. The other prisoners muffled their shackles with cloth so the chains wouldn't clank. The conspirators left a thin layer of wall intact so that fresh air didn't blow in or raise suspicion. Healey claimed he discovered their plan only by accident and that his first impulse was to alert the keeper. Yet he chose to join them, convinced by their promise that they merely wanted to breathe the fresh air and return. Let us know in the comments if you believe Healey's story, and don't forget to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes details from courtroom testimonies. On Sunday, the 27th of October 1816, the men prepared to break through. They chose Sunday evening because the prison was quieter and the warders were relaxed. As dusk fell, the conspirators removed the last bricks and timber, creating a hole just large enough to squeeze through. Culliver poked his head out to scan the roof. Normally a watchman patrolled there, but on this night no guard was seen. One by one, the 6 convicts clambered through the opening onto the prison roof. The air was cold. From their perch they could see chimney tops and lanterns flickering in the fog. But then a terrible realization struck. None of them had thought to bring a rope. The yard below was far too deep for a safe jump. For a moment, panic froze them. Some wanted to turn back. Bowerman, ever the leader, urged them on and offered to descend last. Stories like this hinge on tiny oversights, like forgetting a rope. If you're enjoying this narrative, hit subscribe so you never miss our next tale of human ingenuity in the face of disaster. Bowerman disappeared back through the hole and returned dragging rugs and blankets. These were the coarse coverings each prisoner used to keep warm at night. The men tore the blankets into long strips, twisting and knotting them together. In their haste, the knots were uneven and the rope stiff, but it was all they had. Hickey tied one end to a beam, then slung the rope over the parapet. He tested it with his weight and it held. Slowly he lowered himself hand over hand down the makeshift rope, boots scraping against the rough stone. When his feet touched the yard, he looked up and waved silently. One by one, the others followed. Culliver, Bowerman, Hardy Harrison, and finally Healey. Their hearts raced, the rope creaked, bits of blanket tore, but remarkably all 6 reached the ground without injury. They found themselves in the yard of a private house. Bowerman crept to the door, listened, then tried the latch. It opened into a kitchen. An old woman stood there, startled. Bowerman burst past her. The other men followed. In the confusion, Healey hesitated, maybe out of pity for the woman or fear of the unknown. He lingered in the yard before he could follow. The door slammed and he was trapped. He tried to climb back up the blanket rope but couldn't manage it. The 5 remaining escapees vanished into the night. Healey was recaptured almost immediately. It's these split-second decisions, run or freeze, that change destinies. Stick around and subscribe for more psychological twists in historic escapes. An alternative report, printed soon after the escape, offers more detail. It says the men actually climbed through the roof of their cell, descended into the space between the Old Bailey and the Physicians' College, then crossed into 2 neighbouring houses, eventually reaching the printworks of the County Chronicle. As they scrambled across a roof, a skylight gave way and a resident spotted them, raising the alarm. They scrambled into a yard belonging to a Mr. Letterman, where they encountered the old woman. After forcing past her, they were gone before the watchman could react. Healey was taken first to Giltspur Street Compter, a local lockup, then transferred to the prison hulks. Later reports suggested the 5 fugitives reached a cottage in Barnet, north of London, where a lone woman lived. There they removed their irons and continued their flight. Some speculated they had friends or family waiting to hide them, while others believed they fled to the docks, hoping to stow away on outgoing ships. The Bowerman brothers had connections in the countryside and might have fled there. None were captured immediately. Intrigued by these conflicting accounts? Subscribe. We examine multiple reports in our longer podcast episodes to separate fact from rumour. Of the 6, only Maurice Healey left a first-hand account. Under interrogation by the magistrate, he initially denied knowledge of the escape, but when told he could face harsh punishment if he remained silent, he confessed. Healey claimed he learned of the plot by accident and joined at the last minute. He insisted he intended to alert the keeper, but changed his mind. He described the 5 days of digging, the hiding in the cupboard, and the terror when the men realized they had no rope. Healey's testimony provides the only recorded voice from the escape, and historians debate whether he downplayed his involvement to gain leniency. After his recapture, Healey was sent to the Bellerophon hulk on the 28th of October 1816. The Bellerophon was a former warship famous for receiving Napoleon's surrender in 1815. By 1816 it had been converted into a prison hulk. Contemporary observer Charles Dupin noted that the hulk's cabins had iron grating and simple curtains to admit air, and convicts attended chapel on Sundays. Healey remained there until he was transferred to the Morley transport ship, which departed England on the 18th of December 1816 and arrived at Port Jackson, Sydney, on the 10th of April 1817. Healey thus became one of the earliest convicts to make the voyage under Surgeon Superintendent Robert Espy, known for allowing prisoners time on deck and removing their irons whenever possible. If you want more stories of convicts' journeys aboard hulks and transport ships, subscribe. We'll travel with them across the seas. What happened to the 5 men who escaped? Their fates were partly recorded. Solomon Bowerman was caught sometime after the escape, details are scarce, and transported to Australia. He came from a large, impoverished family. His brother James had been transported earlier for poaching, and his younger brother George's death sentence for burglary had been commuted to transportation. In Sydney, all 3 Bowerman brothers turned to highway robbery. On the 22nd of December 1820, they were executed together for robbing travellers on the Windsor Road. This grim triple hanging demonstrates how exile often failed to reform convicts. James Hickey, Thomas Culliver, John Hardy, and John Harrison dropped from the record. Some suggest they fled to the countryside, and others think they died in poverty under assumed names. The government offered £20 plus £5 for each man's capture, a substantial sum, but no one came forward. By the time of the Morleys' departure in December 1816, none had been recaptured. Their disappearance fed rumours in London. Were they living free somewhere in England, or had they sneaked aboard a merchant vessel and started new lives abroad? We may never know. These lingering mysteries are what keep historians digging. If you love unresolved tales, smash that subscribe button so you never miss an update. News of the escape caused embarrassment for the authorities. The Lord Mayor declared that he would overhaul the city's police so that 200 officers could be mobilised within 10 minutes for any emergency. Mr. Newman, the keeper of Newgate, offered rewards for the escapees' capture. Newspapers mocked the lax security and sensationalised the story. 6 men had slipped from London's strongest prison using only a cupboard and blankets. The incident also highlighted the cruelty and inefficiency of Britain's penal system. Reformers such as Sir Samuel Romilly had already argued in Parliament that the hulks were inhumane and that transportation was often no better. Writers like Elizabeth Fry visited Newgate and campaigned for better conditions, particularly for women and children. Within a few years, parliamentary committees were investigating prison conditions, and new penitentiaries like Millbank were being built. Though the Newgate Six themselves were criminals, their escape exposed systemic problems and galvanised calls for reform. Want to explore how one jailbreak contributed to 19th century penal reform? Subscribe. We unpack these connections in our deep dive episodes. The story of the Newgate Six has all the makings of a modern thriller. Desperate men, an improvised tunnel, a rope of blankets, a heart-stopping descent, a last-minute capture, and 5 vanished fugitives. Yet, unlike Jack Sheppard's famous escapes in the 1720s, this 1816 breakout faded into obscurity. It reappears only in scattered newspaper reports and convict records. In popular memory, Newgate remained notorious for public hangings and debtors, not for the cunning of 6 men who refused to accept exile. What endures is the human desire for freedom. Whether you consider these men villains or victims of a harsh system, their courage in the face of impossible odds is undeniable. They chipped through a wall with primitive tools, crept through darkness, and dangled over death using blankets. They risked everything to avoid being shipped across the world. As you walk the streets around the Old Bailey today, there's no trace of the cupboard, the tunnel, or the blanket rope. But if you stand near Warwick Square and listen, you might imagine the scratch of iron on brick, the whisper of conspirators, and the rustle of blankets becoming a lifeline. If this story moved you, if you want more tales that reveal the human drama behind forgotten crimes, please subscribe. Your support lets us continue to bring these hidden histories to light.